Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one we will be looking at the three scenarios I believe are plausible to happen in the Battle of Avdiivka. Maybe multiple of these could happen at the same time, but pretty much I'll be going over what the plans are and as such what decisions each side will take in the final days of the battle, as it is titled Avdiivka Endgame, because we are nearing the end of the Battle of Avdiivka, where the Russians will most likely come out on top, as we can see with the developments that has happened so far, and the current trend and momentum of the Russian forces indicates that they are going to win this battle. However, this video will be focused on the scenarios, and as such I'll be looking over what both sides are planning and what they will likely take as decisions. So what we're currently seeing is that the Russians are moving through the northern parts in force, while they have a foothold in the southern side that they haven't really done anything with. As for the positions in the flanks, they have been fairly stable. Since the start of the month of February, there's pretty much been no movement whatsoever on the northern and southern flanks. This brings us to scenario number one, the scenario of the Battle of Bakhmut. In the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russians fought on the flanks until they had control over the main supply lines of Bakhmut, after which they went through the city itself and fought through the city, capturing the city before moving on to attack the western parts. This is the first scenario. The Russians will continue staying and holding the flanks as they are and try to bait the Ukrainians into attacking these flanks, while they fight through the center and try to gain control over the city while the fighting is taking place outside. So they are going to be moving through the city, attacking and storming the fortifications and defensive positions throughout the city, while the Ukrainians will be withdrawing bit by bit as they mine the different buildings and try to bait the Russians into positions where they can set up ambushes, and as such be on the defensive and retreat as the fighting continues. In this scenario, the Russians would look to advance through the city rather than the flanks. That means this whole area will mostly be ignored, as the Russians would walk through the central parts of the city, advancing from the north and the south, cutting it into two, which would naturally encircle the eastern forces of the Russian side, and as such they will focus around capturing the citadel area. If the Russians manage to capture the central parts of the city and the citadel area, the whole eastern parts would fall into Russian hands, as the Ukrainians would be forced to either surrender or fight where they are completely physically encircled from the rest of the Ukrainian forces. And in this scenario, the Russians would also completely ignore the coke plant as well as the northern and southern flanks, as all of these areas would be completely irrelevant to the fighting taking place in the central parts of the city. So the Russians in this scenario would just focus on the quickest path to victory instead of a safer and secure one, as they would be looking to go straight for the central parts of the defenses of the Ukrainians in Avdiivka, with the success they've had in the northern parts. However, so far we have seen no movement by the Russians in the southern parts. This is likely due to the Ukrainians here to the southwest of those positions and to the east of those positions, making it difficult for them to move. As such, this would require the Russians to gain control of either the eastern or western parts, or both of them, if they want to then launch offensive operations towards the center of the city from the south. They could also move straight from the northern parts and straight to the citadel area without the corroborative fighting from the south, and capturing that would allow them to then launch attacks towards the northern parts and simply cut off all of these forces to the south, as well as the Ukrainians would have no exit or entry into this area if the Russians have control over the citadel area. So in the end, in this first scenario, the Russians simply go straight for the citadel area and ignores everything else. And the Ukrainians would be fighting and resisting as much as they can, and there is constant Ukrainian reinforcements coming into the city, as the Ukrainians will be refusing to retreat or surrender. The second scenario would be centered around the Ukrainians' actions, and this would be a scenario where the Ukrainians launch counterattacks towards the flanks of the Russian forces. In this scenario, the Ukrainians would look to break the siege of Avdiivka by attacking the vulnerable areas of the Russians in the north specifically, but also in the south, trying to redraw the front line to be along the river line and prevent the Russians from storming the city further by simply attacking the flanks to a point where the Russians would be unable to resupply their forces in the center. In this scenario, the Ukrainians would look to attack the village of Vodiane and Upytne from the city area of Avdiivka and from the Sheverna area to the west of Avdiivka, where they'll look to cut off the Russian forces to the north of the river line by capturing these two villages. As for the northern flank, the Ukrainians would here look to attack directly towards Krasnohorivka. Capturing Krasnohorivka itself would cut off all of the Russian forces here to the north of the river line, where the Russians would only have the Kamyanka area to resupply their forces in the north, which is very close to a Ukrainian fortification here to the east. So in this scenario, the Ukrainians would look to have their main force pushing towards Krasnohorivka and a secondary force here to the south to push towards Vodiane and Upytne. In this scenario, the Ukrainians would be risking a lot to break the siege of Avdiivka, which at this point has significantly decreased in value because the Russians have had their positions within the city itself and the fortifications to the south of the city, which means that the Ukrainians would be fighting across very heavily fortified areas to break the siege and push the Russians back. And at the same time, we see that the Russians will likely put up a fierce resistance as they have a lot of forces in reserve in this battle, as the main force has yet to enter Avdiivka itself. This means that the majority of the forces are actually centered around the flanks to prevent such a scenario. But this scenario is actually very likely to happen, considering Syrsky is now the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces, and this fighting style is centered around doing operations such as these, where the Ukrainians will simply launch frontal head-on assaults towards the Russian positions in the flanks as well as within the city itself. But this would require a very significant amount of forces, especially ground infantry to go into the city and armored vehicles to attack the flanks, as these are open fields. And as such, the Ukrainians would also be pressed on time, because every day that passes, the Russians advance further and further within the city. So with this, we see that in this scenario, which is likely to happen, the Ukrainians are unlikely to succeed because they would require a lot of forces that they don't really have readily available. They would require a lot of ammunition, which they don't have readily available. And the sacrifices it would require would simply leave Ukraine weaker after such an operation than before it started. So the Ukrainians in this reality should focus on withdrawing from the city instead of pouring more soldiers into the city. But as we know, that is not how Syrsky thinks. He's more obliged to hold the city at all costs, even if the costs are heavy. Not like the pro-Ukrainians say 1 to 20 loss rate for the Russians compared to the Ukrainians. They claim that for every 100 Ukrainian soldiers that are killed, 2,000 Russian soldiers would be killed. And that is clearly bogus, that is clearly stupid to say. And as such, we see that the reality of the situation is that we do not really know what numbers are accurate or not, but we do know which numbers are within the scope of reality, and these numbers are clearly not within the scope of reality, as Russians have yet to commit their main force to the Battle of Avdiivka, and with these advances we are seeing, despite that, means that the Russians are not taking heavy casualties. They're instead surviving these battles and overcoming the Ukrainian defensive positions. The Russians likely caught the Ukrainians off guard with the sudden advances here to the north, and as such we saw them take advantage of that by advancing further and capturing significant defensive positions and reaching the main supply line in and out of the city. Finally, we move on to the third scenario, and this is one where the Russians simply do a all-out, full-scale offensive towards Avdiivka, where they attack both the flanks as well as the city itself in an effort to encircle the city completely and take control of all the surrounding villages by attacking everywhere at the same time with a significant force. This would require a large buildup of the Russians, and it's a very risky tactic, so it is unlikely that the Russians will launch such an offensive operation. But it is still a possibility because they have a significant amount of forces available. And if the Ukrainians are going to continuously resupply and restock and send reinforcements to the city, then they have an interest in destroying as much as they can to kind of fight where the Ukrainians are choosing to fight by facing them head on with a stronger force. This is more of a Syrsky strategy, so I don't think the Russians will choose such a strategy, because the Russians are fight averse. They are avoiding head-on fights as much as possible. They only do it when it's necessary, like storming the city of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. That's when they were doing it. But here in this scenario, it's very unlikely that this will happen. As such, these are the three main scenarios. In addition to these three main scenarios, there are three secret scenarios. The first secret scenario is that the Ukrainians use their secret weapon, the Ghost of Kiev, to fly over the city of Avdiivka, jump down on a parachute, and then simply storm the Russian positions, taking down all of the northern flank before storming around, flanking the Russian positions by Krasnovarivka and moving through the highway to the north before moving all the way to the city of Bakhmut in the north and taking back the city of Bakhmut, breaking the siege of Avdiivka, recapturing Bakhmut, and the Russians simply surrender after such a display of strength. That is the first secret scenario. We then move on to the second one, which is one where the Russians simply use their necromancer powers to resurrect all of the forces they have lost throughout this battle and the Battle of Bakhmut, as well as to resurrect Prigozhin, who will go to the center of Avdiivka into the citadel area behind enemy lines, and he will go there to then record a video with a lot of corpses behind him saying, "Where is the shells, Putin? Where's the shells, Shoigu? Where's the shells, Gerasimov?" He doesn't have any shells. And the Russian zombie hordes simply overrun the whole city before advancing to the citadel area, rescuing Prigozhin, and they storm Kiev together straight from Avdiivka towards Kiev in 3 days. The final secret strategy of the Battle of Avdiivka is that the pro-Ukrainian Twitter warriors and the NATO warriors all move in a combined battalion formed in Kiev and goes straight to Moscow, capturing the city of Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod in a couple of days before moving on to Moscow and St. Petersburg within a week, and then finally capturing the city of Vladivostok within the year. So that is the third secret scenario, and that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.